I'm Noah Waldeck from Subjectively Objective, and today I'm going to be interviewing Canadian photographer Kyle McDougall. A lot of you are probably already familiar with Kyle's work from his excellent YouTube channel, and we have quite a bit of history together as well. He was featured in volume 56 of my mini monograph magazine back in 2017. He had an image in Observations in the Ordinary, the survey book I published in 2019. And of course, I published Kyle's first monograph, An American Mile, last year. This is a pretty long interview, but I think you're going to find some really valuable insights in it. We got into a wide-ranging discussion that covered his early work and career, an in-depth discussion about the actual making of An American Mile, and we also talk about what Kyle's working on currently. So stick around and enjoy the interview. It's great to have you here today, Kyle, for this conversation. I think it's going to be really useful for people to hear a little bit deeper insights about your process, what went into making An American Mile, but also just your approach to making work in general. So looking forward to talking with you.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for having me, man.
So we are going to talk a lot about the making of An American Mile and how that's impacted your work that you've made since then. But first, I really want to talk about your earlier work. So to begin with, tell us a little about your background and then how you originally came to photography.
Yeah. So I've been doing photography for, I think, almost 20 years now. I went to film school back in 2005, but shortly before that, I first got interested in it. I think right when I was around 20, I made a move out to Western Canada. I'd always kind of been interested in photography a little bit, but the landscape out, in the Rocky Mountains really inspired me to go and buy a camera while I was out there and just start experimenting, basically. And it was always like something that I enjoyed a little bit, but it wasn't until I moved back home that I decided to go to film school, partly because of an interest in photography, but also I was really interested in filmmaking as well. So went to film school, and then when I graduated in 2007, photography for like the next 10 years just remained like a passion, something that I was absolutely consumed with and that I loved and that I was constantly trying to grow and get better at. But it kind of lived beside my like video filmmaking career, just as this thing I would go and do purely out of passion, which was great. And I did that for about 10 years. And for that entire period, my focus was as a landscape photographer. Again, inspired by that, living out in the Rocky Mountains, but also just where I lived in Ontario, Canada, surrounded by forests and lakes, just always really loved the wilderness. And it was kind of a good excuse, going out with my camera to get out into these environments at, times of day and in weather that I normally wouldn't. So yeah, it was about 10 years of doing, I guess, like traditional landscape work. And for a large portion of that time, I absolutely loved it and was consumed by it.
I can definitely relate as far as having photography be something that you really only do purely for pleasure, not something you're looking to make a living from. It really does allow you to have it be something that you're just very inspired by, and you do it because you like it. You're not trying to pay the bills with it. You're doing it because it's something you're truly passionate about. So I think you came to photography in a way that is something really similar to a lot of people. It really became, even though you had a background going to film school, you were really doing it just for yourself because you wanted to go out and make work. So I'm actually going to show some examples of your early work for everyone to see now. And I think it's going to be really interesting because it really is quite different for the work you're known for making now. So tell us a little about the motivation or the inspiration for making these kind of classic style landscape images that you were doing back then.
Yeah, it's funny. I obviously dug into the archives and sent you some of these images before we sat down for this interview. And it's almost like I kind of filed that part of my career away. I forgot it exists just because, like I said, it's something that I was really passionate about and loved for a long time, but that I eventually kind of fell out of, which I'm sure we'll get to. But I think for, the majority of the time when I was making that work, looking back on it now, one of the huge kind of motivators was just this reason to get out like I said before, into the wilderness, into these environments I loved at times of day that I normally wouldn't, say like, going out into like a dramatic landscape at 5 a.m. and, checking the weather and hoping that there's going to be this like dramatic sunrise, and just like having these experiences that were quite unique. And then obviously trying to document them and also make images that were quite dramatic and loud and exciting, sunsets, sunrises, mist and fog and, coastal scenes and all this stuff. So there was this like thrill of the hunt almost, of like, I can remember some of the trips I would do early in my career where I'd go for like 5 or 6 days by myself to the east coast of Canada, and I'd have all these locations researched, and I'd like, at the end of the trip, I'd almost have this checklist of like, okay, I got like 10 keepers, 10 dramatic shots to add to my portfolio. So I think it was just a combination of really enjoying these environments, really having a love for the wilderness and the landscape, and then having this like exciting practice of going out and trying to make things that were kind of loud and colorful and exciting.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can relate to starting out in a similar way, really focusing in on the classic picturesque beauty aspect of it. I think that's one of the first things a lot of people come to in photography. Even if it's the Ansel Adams type, like, wow, these are like such dramatic looking scenes of the natural landscape that you're like, I want to make work like that too. Something though I think that is specifically interesting in your career is that even though I think a lot of people start that way, I think you got much further with it than most people did. Like you said, you made work like that for probably almost 10 years. So you really honed your craft in making these type of classic landscape images. So what then is it that set you off on a different path?
Yeah, so I think, like I said, for the majority of those, let's call it 10 years I was doing that type of work, I was consumed, and I had ambitions to, get better and better and maybe, gain recognition for my work and do different things. But probably like the last 2 years, I started to experience, I guess, call it like a lack of fulfillment, like just going out to these locations and kind of having these experiences, and not necessarily I was still enjoying the experiences, but even if I made an image that in the past I would have been incredibly excited about, I just started to really lack interest and like fulfillment from them. And it took me a really long time to understand why. And for like a 2 year period, I was just like completely consumed on trying to fix the problem, try and figure out like, why isn't this working anymore? I'm having success. I'm making images I would have loved in the past. And it wasn't until 2017 I decided to do a trip out to the east coast of Canada, out to Newfoundland by myself. It's kind of like my last ditch effort to try and like, fix this, to get my love back for it again. I went out right as winter was ending, incredible coastlines and icebergs and just like the perfect conditions. You couldn't ask for more. And I remember leaving that trip so unfulfilled and so frustrated, and just honestly thinking that the solution was to maybe go and do something else. I just thought maybe photography isn't for me anymore. I didn't ever, for whatever reason, I didn't stop to think like, oh, maybe I should just try something else, right? Like this isn't the only thing that photography is. But I guess maybe just stubbornness. And I think also it's easy we put ourselves in boxes at times. You can kind of create this image of what you do and how you do it, and it can become difficult to shift. So that was really when I started to lose interest over that period. And that was like the breaking point. And that aligned with a few months later, a trip that my wife and I decided to do. We wanted to make some changes. So we actually sold our house. We bought a truck and trailer, and we decided to go drive across Canada in the United States for a year. And I obviously brought my camera gear. We set out on this trip. For the first few weeks, I didn't touch my camera at all. And then I experimented a little bit as we got out into dramatic landscapes, trying to do landscape stuff again. But it wasn't until like 3 months into the trip, we got to the West Coast, US, Portland to be exact. And on a whim, I went and bought a film camera, purely just because, and just started to go out and shoot. It's like, it almost felt like this return to the start of my career again. I hadn't shot film since school. There was so much I needed to learn, and I just went out with no expectations or no pressure and purely went and did photography for the fun of it, for that initial period of time. And, we can get into how An American Mile evolved from there afterwards, but that is kind of the turning point for me and what brought back some of the excitement and love for photography that I'd been missing for a pretty long time.
I think that story really, though, offers a lot that people can gain from it. As someone who had actually really established yourself, you were, even your self-image you had of Kyle McDougall, classic landscape photographer, even once you didn't feel like that was what you wanted to be doing anymore, it was really hard to break yourself out of that box because you felt like, well, this is what I do. Like, I got to keep doing the thing I do. If I'm not doing that, what am I doing? So it's interesting to hear you kind of tried for a couple years after you weren't interested in it anymore to keep trying to make it work. And I think that actually could be something that relates to a lot of people, not necessarily about their work in general, but even with a specific project. Maybe you've set out to say, I'm going to make this long-term project about this thing. And then you realize, like, I'm really not into making these images anymore. And maybe you keep taking a few trips and saying, well, I got to keep working on it. Like, it's not done yet. I got to go make more. I got to round it out. Like, it's not finished, but maybe it is finished. Like, maybe you've really kind of naturally come to the end of the line and you need to move on to something else in order to keep yourself, creatively fulfilled and excited about making work. Because it sounds like you started from this point where you were really excited, you honed your craft, and then you got to a point where you weren't excited anymore. And then you didn't get the same feeling from making the work. So allowing yourself to always be in a place where you're making work that you're excited to make, I think that's, what allows you to be fulfilled and happy in making the work, specifically when it's not something you're doing for a living necessarily. It's something you're doing because it's your passion.
Yeah, it's honestly one of the most important lessons that I've learned in my career. And I learned it somewhat. I mean, I'd been doing that stuff for 10 years, but still somewhat early on. And it's really helped me, since then, moving forward with so many things, just like you talked about, even with projects, even with so many things, just like being willing to change, not setting, like, I think it's obviously good to a degree to have, consistency and stick with things, but there is an extreme you can get to where you're, like me, where I'm just like, nope, this is what I do. And this like resistance to change. So it's really, really taught me and helped me moving forward just with all sorts of different aspects of, if things aren't working, like it's okay to try something different or abandon things that, aren't working and whatnot. So I definitely took a lot away from that.
Yeah, I think the idea of kind of accepting some things have a natural ending can be a really useful lesson to learn. But getting back to where your path took you from there, so beginning to make the images that ended up turning out, to be An American Mile that ended up in this book, talk about that turning point of you discovering the imagery specifically of the American Southwest.
Yeah, so I think, like I said, getting back into film, buying that film camera, 6x6 TLR. And I think the biggest thing for me is, like I said, it was the first time in a really long time where I felt this excitement about photography again. And it almost took me back to the start of my career where like you go out, like I can remember the early first few months of photography for me. Like being so interested and curious and going out and shooting the most random stuff and like not caring, just like accepting that I didn't know what I was doing and playing around and messing with things on the computer when I got home. And this period of time really kind of reminded me of that, where I was going out, learning how to work with film again and just documenting our trip as we went. And not waking up at 5 a.m. to try to go down to the coast to get the perfect sunrise or whatever, like shooting in very different conditions and a very more like subtle approach and just very different than what I'd done in a long time. And, I kept doing that for a bit and we eventually got down to the American Southwest. And I just had this like 6 month period once we got down there of being so excited, like the complete opposite of how I'd been feeling for the couple of years before that. Just being so excited about photography again, having this new kind of approach and new interest, getting back into film, discovering all these new artists, just learning about this history to photography that I wasn't that aware of in the past, and all these different bodies of work and certain photographers who have become my favorites nowadays. And I think all of those things just combined to, give me this like energy that I'd been lacking for a long time. And that kind of coincided with us being in Nevada, Arizona, Southern California, all these places where there's this landscape that also just fascinated me so much. And I think it was just a number of things that came together that led to me making images for a pretty long period of time where, like, I guess you're in the zone, like when you're making work, you're out there and things just feel right and you aren't really overthinking it and you're shooting and you're just having fun. And that really is what this work was born out of. That was like the first 6 or 8 months of making it. And then obviously a number of years after that with return trips. But it was that initial period of just like this curiosity and love for things again that sparked it.
I think it's really great to hear that even someone who was as accomplished as you were at what you were doing before, that you still felt like you had the opportunity to really have a fresh start and almost kind of come back to it like you did when those very early days of discovering photography, you kind of allowed yourself the freedom to go back to that, and ended up turning out being really the most significant turning point in your career, that you ended up making work that, you still built upon the craft you had developed before, but you allowed yourself a freedom to kind of discover what really excited you again. And that turned out to be the American Southwest. So once you discovered you were drawn to making that work for an American Mile, how soon did you end up deciding to say, I have something here, this was exciting, I loved making it, now I want to turn it into a larger project?
Yeah, honestly, it took some time for sure. I think, talking about like self-image and putting yourself in a box and stuff, like even once I got into this phase of making this work and being consumed by it, those first few months, I still can, I've spoken about this before, but I can remember, and this sounds ridiculous, but being so like hesitant to share it. Maybe not hesitant, but so like, I also don't want to say nervous, but just thinking that like, I'm going to put this out there and people are going to be like, what is this? Because again, I knew myself as this landscape photographer and I'm shooting these dramatic landscapes and stuff. And all of a sudden it's like, here is a very kind of mundane shot of a power pole in the middle of a empty desert. It's like in the middle of the day. It's like the complete opposite of what I'd done in the past. But kind of all that mattered to me at that point is like, it's just what I loved. Like I was enjoying the work I was making and it was fulfilling and I was excited. And where I was at before that was the complete opposite. So it just felt right to move forward with. But what was so funny is once I started to share the work, this work and kind of where I've gone since has been the most well received out of anything I've ever done. Which I think is important for me to reflect on and also mention at times, because I think it's just a good example of how we can get in our own heads about how good our work is or isn't. And really, oftentimes we're quite wrong with that. So I think as we got to the end of that year-long road trip, I still try to keep things pretty loose and not make any decisions right away, because I wanted to maintain that, I didn't want to jump back into trying to make it into something too quick. I was just having fun with photography again. But I think as that trip got to the end and I started to see like a body of work build up and I still had this excitement to go back and visit these locations again, that's when I knew like, okay, this is the new direction. Like this is what I want to do. And it set me down this path, obviously, of returning and then making a lot of work and making it into a book eventually. But also, the direction I'm going now and the projects I'm working on, it's all kind of snowballed from there and really taken me in this direction that I could have never, ever predicted before.
Well, that's really interesting. I'm curious, what percentage of what ended up in the final book would you say was from your initial several months you spent shooting?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know if I could give like a fairly specific number, but I will say like quite a bit of it, which is interesting. I made a number of trips back over I think the next 3 years. And like not like month-long trips out there, but I'd go back by myself for 10 days, purely by myself in a rental car with the purpose of making images. So like making a lot of work over these next trips. But as I go through it and I like look, I would honestly say like maybe 50% made it into the book, maybe more from that initial trip, maybe 60%, which is pretty substantial when you consider that was like the first 6 months of it, and then I made numerous trips back. But yeah, flow, right? Like sometimes you're just in the zone and things are working, and I think you gotta just embrace that as much as you can.
Yeah, no, you definitely were able to capitalize on then what you discovered, and you did get into that flow or that groove there. But also, I will say you did have a fairly long time to keep exploring it by the nature of the being on that year road trip. Maybe not everyone, when they discover a new project, is going to be able to pursue it so completely right out of the gate. But I do think the idea that you grabbed onto that idea and you said, I'm going to run with this new thing, even though maybe you were, as you talked about before, you were hesitant to like let that be your new photography persona. You were still thinking, I'm the classic landscape guy. What's anyone going to think about these, high key desert at noon landscapes? But you were excited to make them. And so you followed the thread. You decided not to, let yourself say like, oh, I got to stop making these. These aren't really my thing. Like you really ran it down. And so it's, great that you were able to have that opportunity to get such a good start into making the project. And then from there, really start to round it out with the additional trips you talked about over the next few years. So now though, let's talk about, when did you know that you wanted An American Mile to turn out to be a book?
Yeah, so I think what was interesting for me is not only was this a period of time where I discovered kind of like a new interest and new direction and approach with my work, but starting to make this work, like I said before, introduced me to, at the same time, to this entire world of photography that I didn't know anything about. Like I said, from specific artists or specific photographers that are incredibly well known to different movements and different styles and just this history of photography that I really didn't know anything about. And that was exciting. Like Stephen Shore obviously is incredibly well known, but like up until that point, I wasn't familiar with his work. And it was such an eye-opener for me that there was this, this way of working that was so different from what I'd done in the past. So I think obviously making these images took off and I kind of ran with it. But at the same time, as I started to, immerse myself in these other worlds, I started to get into photo books, really immerse myself in the world of, different photographers and different books and just the different possibilities of what you could do with your work. And I think that combined with this body of work starting to grow, I started to see that as like, the goal to aim for is to like, I love the idea of like making this work and finalizing it and putting it out in book form and the project's done. Because in the past with the landscape work I did, it's almost like I just had this running collection of themes. And I'm just like, am I just going to make forest images for the rest of my life? Like there's no way to finalize or cap anything off. So there was a huge appeal with me, for me with that as well. Just knowing that, okay, I could go to the Southwest and I could shoot for the next 50 years and probably have like a pretty good time doing it. But it's nice to move on and, getting to a point where I felt like, okay, I like what's here, and then publishing it in book form feels like, okay, this is done now and I can kind of move on to what's next.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good lesson for people to learn that sometimes if you are making work where it just has this kind of like, even as broad as I make landscape images. I actually see this on people's websites a lot, that they'll have their images, categorized as like landscape, people, or portraits, uh, you know, street. And it's just like this one broad thing, which actually does have this kind of historic context. A lot of actually older, probably before the 70s photo books were more kind of like that, where it was just a collection of an artist's work kind of throughout their career and all the different stuff they did. But since then, even kind of talking about, for instance, Stephen Shore's work, or William Eggleston's or something like that, where it really started to be thought of more as kind of project-based work. And it's even before that, those are just the color photographers thinking of. But making work where it has a specific project and doesn't just fall into the really large, these are landscape images buckets, does give you actually, even though it's a little more limiting, there's a certain type of freedom that comes with that, because it allows you to say, I'm going to make images about these, and once I feel like I've made enough and I've said what I wanted to say, you're free to move on. You don't have to have them, it always be this long running thing where, like you said with your work before, if you kept doing it for 50 years, you'd have more and more, picturesque, beautiful images of the Canadian forests, but like, would they really get to the point where you were like, oh, this project is wrapped up? Not really, because it wasn't really a specific project you were working on. You were just kind of generally making work. And having a specific project allows you the freedom to say, you get to a point where I feel like I've done enough, and then you can, move on to the next thing. And so that allowed you to do that.
Well, and sorry to jump in there, but as you're talking about this, it's made me think, like, maybe that's a huge appeal. Obviously, there's a lot of things that appeal to me about this work and the work that I'm doing now, but here I was before with this essentially open-ended landscape work that just dragged on to the point where I wanted to quit. So maybe, a big appeal of this new stuff that I'm doing is, I had a really good time working on this for 4 years or whatever it was. But it's now like I'm doing work in North Wales, black and white, large format stuff, and I'm doing a few other projects I'm playing around with. So it's like, this is maybe a nice contrast to how I used to work, where it's like, I really enjoyed this. It's done. I'm going to go to what's interesting me next. And obviously they all have similar feel to them in terms of like approach, but it is giving me an opportunity to not get stuck with like that one thing again for a really long time, to the point where I just wear it out completely.
Yeah, and I think that there's there's other forms of art that work in a similar way. I definitely think music can be similar. You make an album, you are trying to make these songs that all fit together as a group, and then you put it out, and like maybe your next album, you've moved on to a little bit of a different sound. You can explore something different. You don't have to be just making more and more of the same throughout your career. And I think that's actually one of the really nice things about photography specifically as an art form, is that it really works, I think, best in the form of a series or a project where, you can have all the images you've made from your career. And if you look back at them, there's probably going to be a lot of similar threads, even if you've explored, different camera formats or black and white or color, or, you shot this stuff 35 point and shoot, and you shot some other, 4x5, 8x10 stuff. Like, maybe there are a lot of different things you did. And when you look back on it all, it's very possible that you'll see all of this stuff, is clearly from the same person that has the same vision. But by having those individual projects, it allows you to kind of put all your focus into that for a while. And then when it's naturally wrapped up, move on. And I think that's the important takeaway too, is how you spent 4 years making An American Mile, but like, not every project is something that someone's going to want to spend 4 years on. Maybe it's a project you end up saying, I want to spend, a couple weeks on, and then you felt like, okay, that was all I had to say, ready to move on. It's not going to be the biggest project. You're not going to make a huge book out of it probably, but like, that's okay. Like, you still, got something worthwhile out of it, and it can be, moving on to the next stage of your work.
Yeah, man, I agree. The one thing I wanted to add as well with this transition phase, and I think that's really important, is looking back, I think it's easy for us to get attached to things that we have done for a long time and that we know, almost like you're protecting your ego a bit, right? Because it's like, if I stick with this thing, I know I'm pretty good at it and it's working. And honestly, one of the biggest challenges for me letting go of that landscape work and going into this stuff was being okay with like, I don't want to say being a beginner again, because I'd obviously been doing photography for a long time, but it felt like I was entering a new world. And for a really long time doing this work, it was easy to almost like feel like an imposter a little bit. I don't want to say like imposter syndrome, but it's just like I felt like I was stepping into a bit of a new arena where I had a lot to learn, and it was more intimidating for me than just sticking with what I knew in the past of landscape photography and having my voice and stuff. So that's one thing that I try and keep in mind as well, is like, I think it's important to always like, yeah, on top of not making sure you put yourself in a box, just like be okay with like knowing that you're constantly going to have stuff to learn, and like almost embracing that, like stepping into new arenas where like there's this entire new world that you're unfamiliar with, where you have to learn a lot of things again.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I didn't mention it before, but I think something that's an interesting related aspect of that process, and maybe you came to it, you started making the work first, and then you started discovering these other artists that had already kind of trodden the paths that you were doing. I do think one really useful way that other people, one, can inspire themselves to find new avenues of work to make if they feel like they're getting a little bit stuck, or even just to, be inspiration to find your own voice and where you fit in, is particularly when it comes to landscape work. Because unlike some other forms of photography, which are always about like, what's the new thing, what's kind of like, the new movement, or the, what's the trend right now, landscape photography in general isn't really like that. Both the traditional landscape photography you were doing, I mean, there's a really long tradition of that, but then there's also a very long tradition now of people making what would be considered more contemporary landscape work that's about the built world and not just the picturesque, unspoiled environments. But that has a very long tradition, and so anyone who's operating in that field, nobody's reinventing the wheel. You're always doing something that someone else has already done before to some degree. But that doesn't make, it so you can't make good work too. You just kind of have to find, where do I fit in with that tradition? And so looking at the work of other people, looking at other photo books, like, is such a valuable resource to kind of find your place in that, and also can provide a lot of inspiration as you go into it.
Yeah, no, I agree completely, man. And I think like regardless of what it is or how many times it's been done, I spoke about this recently on a video on my channel, but I think like at the root of it, for me, what's most important and where everything starts is just like, does this interest me? You know what I mean? Like, does this thing excite me? And like the work in this book, obviously the American West has been photographed endless amounts, and it's especially popular nowadays as well. But like the photographs I was making for this for like the first 3, 4, 5 months, like purely were just based off of like exploring these landscapes and stuff that excited me and interested me. Like I wasn't at that point really to like, I wasn't consuming much of what was out there already. So I think regardless of anything, you got to just like stick with, first and foremost, like whatever excites you and feels right and interests you.
Yeah. And I think that point specifically because, it seems like pretty much everything has already been done before. The thing that you have that's valuable to contribute is what interests you personally. Like, take the American West, very well-trodden subject matter. And again, it's particularly popular now, but, even as a curator and someone who loves photography, I love to see different photographers' images made in the same location, because you always get that little sliver of their own, personality and their vision in there. Like, two different people in the same place, like, we're both drawn to the same subject matter. That's the common thread. But the way they approach making an image there can be, completely different. Or even if it's somewhat similar, there's like the small nuances that make it different. And like, that's what makes it special, is that this is Kyle's image, of this iconic place in the West, and that makes it unique to you and your own, particular set of interests.
Adding to that, I always think about this too when people talk about, doing stuff that's original. I've had people ask me before, like, how do you find something completely unique? And I don't think the solution is to set out first and foremost to find something unique, because I think at the root of it, just like we talked about, there has to be this interest and excitement, because like you could go find them maybe the most unique project ever, but if you hate making it, it's not going to be successful, So I think there needs to be like a genuine interest and excitement. And oftentimes, even if that starts with something that maybe has been well documented before, iconic locations or whatever, oftentimes that could even just be like the start. And then as you make work at those popular places, maybe you discover something that then takes you down a path that you wouldn't have discovered otherwise, So I think about that often too.
Absolutely. No, for sure. I think making work that you're excited about is the number one key ingredient to making something good. You don't have to worry so much about the other parts. But at the same time, I think being as knowledgeable as you can about the background and other people who have come before only serves to help you make what you're making even stronger. So now let's though get into a little bit about the process of actually making an American Mile into a book. This is going to be stuff we've already discussed together while we were originally working on it, but I think it's going to offer some really good insights for people to hear both your perspective as the artist and, my perspective as the publisher. So this part we're going to treat a little bit, just as a conversation where you can share your experiences and I'll share some of mine when it comes to the process of making the book. So first off, once you decided that you wanted to make an American Mile into a book, what was the next step for you, as the artist?
I think it was to start looking for someone to work with who had experience with the bookmaking process, not specifically just from like a production standpoint, but also like someone to help me not make sense of the work, but figure out how to start forming it into something, I guess, like cohesive. Obviously, there was intentionality behind making it as I started to do multiple trips back. But as someone, again, who had just worked in this like single image approach in the past, doing this landscape stuff in these categories, I knew that if I were to go and try and pursue this by myself, not only would it take a really long time, but I would probably just make a bunch of obvious decisions that weren't the best ones, if that makes sense. It was a matter for me of trying to find someone who I could work with, who could, get a second set of eyes on this work, help me kind of edit it down, and then help me sequence it as well. So basically just someone who had a lot more experience with me, hence why me and you started chatting.
Yeah, no, and that was a very fortuitous conversation, because I had seen the work as you were making it. I'd featured it in one of my mini monographs several years before we ended up doing the book. And so I'd always actually had your work in the back of my mind as like, that would be a nice book someday. Like, I'd like to work with Kyle on that. So when you reached out to me about it, I was like, hey, I'd been thinking the exact same thing. So, but also, you talking about what you were looking for to work with someone in a book is exactly what I'm looking for in an artist to work with on a project, because there is a really wide spectrum of approaches from different publishers and how involved they want to be when it comes to making and developing a book. That can range from some publishers are pretty hands-off. They really are only interested in seeing, your finalized book design. And then if it's something they like, they'll publish it. But they're not necessarily interested in helping you develop it. They basically sometimes they want even, a finalized maquette to say, okay, this is a good book. Like, we're happy to publish it. They want things to publish that are pretty much fully formed.
Yeah, I was just going to say, what was interesting for me with this approach is, for a really long time in my career, I was the type of person who I really would try and do it all myself. Even in the video and filmmaking world, like I enjoyed small crews where I had like my hands on a lot of aspects of things. But I've always known that like one of the ways that I can improve is to start getting help and involving other people who are much more knowledgeable and much more talented than I am with, with things like, bookmaking and editing and sequencing and all these things. So for me, it was the first time I had gone and kind of taken a large piece of work, something that I was really excited about, and basically just given it to someone else. Obviously me and you went through and we both pulled like our favorites and we sort of narrow things down from there. But really like a lot of control went to you where I was like, you have a lot more experience than I do, much more knowledgeable with this. Here it is. Like, I trust you. And that was such a good lesson for me. Obviously, it was why the book turned out how it did, but it also was such a great reminder for me moving forward with a lot of other things to like involve other people as much as possible. Just because, again, if I were to have done this, the book would have looked very different. It probably wouldn't even exist because it would have taken me like 4 extra years to figure out all the specifics with it and everything. But I think there's so much value there is like, partnering up if you can with someone who can help you with these other aspects, because there's so much to it. Obviously making the images is work in itself, but editing things and sequencing and even just like the design and the logistics, and there's so many things that go into it now that I just can't imagine having tried to figure out by myself.
Yeah, and exactly. That's the again, what I was saying is it's really what I'm looking for to work with someone is on a project where I can be involved and help them really make the thing be the best version of itself. I'm not looking to, make someone's work something that it's not, but I want to help someone make it be the best version of what they've already made. Like, your images are the raw materials, and I want to help you take those raw materials and form it into the best version of a book. So, on the other hand, of some publishers being very hands off, they just want the, ready to go to print with the finished product. I want to be involved in all of those aspects, because I feel like for me as a publisher, as a curator, as an editor, as a designer, I feel like I can bring the most to the project when I really have the opportunity to really collaborate and take my strengths and bring them to the, the great images that have already been created. So to me, that's what really appeals to me. And it sounds like that's what appealed to you as, finding me in Subjectively Objective as a very hands-on approach that I was willing to be there and, work on the aspects of the book that you felt like were something that you wanted help on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like, I know it is different for everyone. I've spoke with other photographers who are like, I would like to publish my book, but like, I would like to sequence it and this, and then like, obviously it's different for everyone. And there's really, I guess, like no right or wrong way. But I know for me, I've really come to appreciate that like partnership where, you bring certain things to making this what it is. I bring the images, and obviously like it wasn't completely hands off. What I liked about it is we would kind of do things together. Like we would select together, and then you would do the initial sequence and we would go over it, and we would, bounce things back and forth. I would talk about things that stood out to me, and you would, give me your reasoning behind them, or we would make tweaks. And, we did that through multiple iterations. So there was like, I still really enjoyed the fact that it wasn't just like, here's my images, and you were like, here you go. We're not changing anything. There was this like really nice partnership with it. But certainly I love the idea of like, being a photographer, especially with what I do nowadays, is such a solo endeavor. I'm in here by myself all the time. So I'm really also coming to appreciate just like, partnering up with someone and making something like this project into something that it wouldn't be if it were just me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that idea of having, a trusted partner you can work with on making the thing that you're making better is, certainly really valuable. And I mean, there's certain industries too where that's almost a given, like like the film industry, even if you're making small films, like, you know, the director and the DP and the person who's actually going to edit it are not necessarily the same people. I mean, if it's really small, maybe they all are the same person. But even if it's a little bit larger, small film, like those are going to all be separate roles, and they're going to work together. The director has to be able to trust their film editor to make the right type of cuts that fit their vision, but also they're not going to like hover over their shoulder and make all the cuts themselves, because then like what's the point of having the film editor? Or if they're going to set up all of the shots themselves, like what is the director of photography doing? So having people you can work with and trust for them to bring their special expertise to make your thing the best version, I think is a really useful tool. And that's my whole approach for it into publishing stuff. But again, like you said, that's not the only way to do it, or even the best way. Some artists, for them, it makes most sense. They really want to control every aspect. And so they are looking for someone to publish their work who is, hands off enough to the point where they're going to just say, yeah, if this is what you want to do, let's go ahead and do it. But I think that there's also a lot of value, as I see it, from the approach we took to making this book.
Yeah, and the one thing I wanted to say, we had spoke about this a few times, but just between the two of us. But obviously, this isn't to say that like anyone who wants to go and do a book or something is going to be in a position where they're like, here's a publisher and someone who I can collaborate and it's going to be a good fit and all that stuff. But even just the importance of like getting some other eyes on your work or some other feedback, or just getting out of that position of you being the only one immersed in your project and finalizing it. I think even that in itself, maybe it's not going to be you taking your work to someone and them sequencing and doing all these things, but just having feedback and eyes and opinion, I think is really important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be realistic too, I would say I'm definitely on the one extreme of publishers as being super hands-on. Most publishers are not quite as hands-on as I am, but there's also a lot, in the middle between totally hands-off and totally hands-on that are going to want to be involved in some parts, but not as involved in other parts. So, and that's why, it's good there's a lot of different publishers for, each individual artist, if they are publishing something, to find someone who's the right fit for them and the way they want to make their work. I'm curious though, this specific question, talking about this, because you were, very open to collaborating, but how comfortable were you letting me come up with, let's say, an initial selection from everything you had? I always want to see everything that an artist has to work with at the beginning of their project. How did that feel, even like, letting me get a chance to explore images that you had already, cut because you maybe didn't think they were going to make it?
Yeah, honestly, I think there's like a bit of excitement to see what you would come up with when we did. Again, from what I can remember, we both took the master collection, and I think the first thing we did was we said, okay, I'll take these and I'll pick my favorites, and you go and you pick your favorites. And then we kind of had a meeting where we went, this is what I chose and that's what you chose, kind of thing. So I think there was an excitement to it because, again, this was a pretty new endeavor for me. So I was very open to like learning, but also just like, I think being so invested in your own work for such a long period of time, I think you've looked at it with such a detailed eye and you've been so critical and you've selected your favorites. And I just thought like, hey, this will be really interesting to give it to someone who is detached from it. They weren't making it, they haven't lived with it for 4 years or whatever, and just see what comes of that. And it was interesting when we kind of narrowed down our edits or our selections, there were a bunch of images that you had picked, and I was like, really? Like my initial reaction was like, really? Like I think we even talked about a few, like we would go through them all and I would say like, well, I don't like, it's not that I thought they were bad, but it's just they were never like one that was like, this is a definite when I make something finally. So I think my initial reaction would at times be like, I kind of can't believe you chose this one. But the really cool thing is once I sat with that for a bit, and then as we started to sequence and pair things, I would start to kind of see where you were going with a lot of that, and really come to like appreciate a lot of those selections you made. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying at the start of wanting to go and work with someone, because those are just things like, I think there's the possibility to miss out on so much potential if you're doing it yourself and you're just wrapped up and invested in what you know. And yeah, there's pairs and there's images in this book that I've come to really, really enjoy. Some of them have become my favorites that certainly wouldn't have been in here if it were just me living with this work by myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly, to me, that's what I love to, have the opportunity to bring to a project, is again to sometimes even, help the artist appreciate their own work in a way they hadn't considered before, and almost give them the opportunity to see their own work through a different set of eyes, to see, like you were saying, sometimes your first reaction was like, why did you pick that? Like, what did you see in this that I wasn't seeing? But then after you got an opportunity to see where I was going with it, how it was going to work in the sequence or as a pair or anything like that, it kind of helped you say like, oh, this is how this is being used. And again, I think that's something to, a really useful thing as an artist, to realize that like the way other people perceive your work is always going to be different from how you perceive it. But if you're getting, good feedback from someone else, like it can help you learn a lot about the way that not just that one person is going to see your work, but how a lot of other people are going to see your work, because you get that little distance from their perspective where you can start to be like, oh, that's how other people are seeing that image, even though that's not what you would have thought yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can take a lot away from that for like moving forward in terms of like vision and approach. Like, so this right here, this is one of my favorite pairs in the entire book. And what's interesting is like, when I look at these images, like I like both of these, and I had always liked both of these images. But if I were going through the work to kind of edit it down and make my selections, those wouldn't have been on my radar probably, just because I maybe would have had this like bit of tunnel vision, focusing more on like the, wider landscapes and stuff. So not only the images by themselves, but then seeing the pair and how well they kind of pair with one another and what they become when they're side by side. So even stuff like this, like, yeah, has become one of my favorite pairs in the books. And it's made me, like I said, moving forward, obviously with the new work I'm doing, just, it's almost like it plants a little something kind of in my head when I'm out making work for new projects, when it comes to like variety or the potential that lives with quieter images or more detail oriented images. So yeah, I just want to point that one out because that's one of the first ones that comes to mind.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear, specifically with that pair, how it started to mean something new to you, that you hadn't dismissed them as images, but they weren't on your radar for like, these got to be in the book. And I will say that is something we did do when, coming up with the sequence for this book specifically. I would say, I actively chose, after seeing everything you had, feeling like your book would be even stronger for having some of those little softer moments in there, things that weren't always just the straightforward kind of iconic landscape, added a level of depth and subtlety to the work, where it's not that it wouldn't have been a good book if it was just all the really, killer, straightforward, really bold landscapes, but I don't feel like it would have had, like I said, as much depth or nuance to it. It would have been just a little bit of a simpler, more straightforward book. It would still been good, enjoyable work, but I don't know that it would have been as good of a book as an actual object.
For sure. Yeah, no, I agree.
Let's talk a little bit about design now. How much of an idea did you have about what you wanted for the final book design before we started the process?
Um, Honestly, I would say it was fairly open. Like it wasn't, I've spoke with some people who go into the bookmaking process and they have like a very clear vision of exactly what they want. I wasn't really like that at all. And I think, again, part of the reason for that is because this was my first book. And, I'd been into photo books for a few years, but I think I was just so consumed with making the work that I hadn't really stopped to think too much about the specifics. So it wasn't until we started to maybe edit the images down and get to the point where it's time to start thinking about these specifics where I, you know, started to explore different ideas and we spoke and stuff. So I would say I was fairly open, and it was kind of like, you know, digging in and coming up with ideas as we walked through the individual steps, even from like, okay, we have the images now. What size should we do? What shape should the book be? What should we do for a cover design? And again, this is where it was really helpful to be able to work with someone like yourself, where we could, for obviously you'd done a number of books before, so you were like, oh, I'll send cloth samples, and then all of a sudden that kind of eliminated part of the process for me. Not that it's a big deal, but I didn't have to worry about like, where do I get cloth? What are the different types? It was like, here's color swatches, and we could kind of go from there. So I would say like it was a big learning process for me, and I took it one step at a time. Whereas now, after having done the book and now moving on to new projects, like with Slate City, for example, my work up in North Wales, it's a ways out from being a book, but throughout the whole time I've been making the work, I've been thinking about things, even like, what color I want the cover to be and how the title could appear, and even like, designs on the inside and all this stuff. So very much different. This, an American Mile was like unfolded as it happened. And now that I have experience with it, I'm, thinking about that much more with the work I'm doing now.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting to hear how that's impacted your process going forward, of kind of starting from almost a more blank slate thing to you feeling maybe like you have more specific opinions now that you've done the process once. These are ideas that are now like floating around in your head where they weren't even things that you'd considered before. It's quite interesting to hear that. For me, I think it was interesting. I remember specifically, I agree, you didn't have a lot of specific ideas of what you wanted the design to be, but you did have a book that you showed me as a reference that really only ended up being about more of the slightly squarer rectangle, because this is actually, I think, an interesting point that I actually really enjoyed with the design of the book, is that because you also, partly the nature of how you came to shooting an American Mile, you have three different aspect ratios of images in there. You have some 4x5, large format stuff. I don't know if you shot any 6:7 that's pretty similar to that, but you also had some 6:4:5, 3:4 aspect ratio stuff. And then you also have 35mm 3:2 aspect ratio stuff. So it was like, as a design challenge, what type of book design can we do that serves all of those different formats well? Mostly landscapes too, but you do have some vertical images. And I believe you'd mentioned this book called it's Wim Wenders' Written in the West. And that's kind of a book that has a similar, it's, a landscape oriented rectangular book, but it is a little bit more square than one that's, kind of long and skinny. And we didn't actually even like the way the page margins on that book worked, but that's kind of this is kind of a good shape for it to be. And then from there, we did something which I think is a little bit unique, but I actually feel like works really well, is that when you have the different format images, so for instance, here, this is a 6:4:5, 3:2 format. Here we have a couple of 35, actually, no, those are same thing here. Okay, so these are 35 formatted images. And then let's also find one that is a 4x5 here. Okay, and then here's a 4x5. And what we actually did is we made it so that each different image format is actually printed at a slightly different width. But what it's allowed us to do is make all of these images actually to have basically an equal area of the image. So when you visually look at them, you don't really necessarily notice, the difference in width between the 35 and the 4x5, which is the biggest contrast there. The 4x5 isn't quite as wide on the page, but because they're the same area, it actually gives them all a really similar visual weight to them. And so it doesn't necessarily mean it. If they were the same width, the 4x5s are going to like naturally feel more prominent than the 35 images because they'll be the same width and they'll be taller. They'll have a greater, surface area of image. So like little things like that I always see as kind of a fun design challenge. But I think when you implement those type of things and figure out what, format of the book works best for this particular group of work. So something that I always think though is worthwhile to consider when you're designing a book is really what type of design decisions can you make that are going to be best suited to the work that you have in that particular book, because it's not always going to be the same. I mean, you actually do see books where sometimes the work feels like it's almost shoehorned into a given book design or format, like they're all landscape images, but they've put them in a portrait oriented book. When I see a book like that, it always makes me think like, maybe they decided that their budget was only going to work for a book of a specific size and they like didn't consider any other options. But I think it always works really nicely when you're able to customize the way you approach designing the book to making it fit the work as best as it can, which I think we were able to do really successfully with An American Mile.
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about that now because I almost forgot about that, but it was such a major thing on my mind when we got into working with all of the images, because like I'm usually someone who's very particular, which is can be negative, quite a negative thing at times, or a bit of a roadblock. So for me to have this body of work that wasn't just one aspect ratio was like kind of driving me a little bit nuts inside. Even though it very like once we were done and once you designed the book and we put it all together, it works perfectly fine. And I'd seen your other your compilation books that you've done where you're obviously working with a wide range of aspect ratios and it always works. But for me, I'm just like, like it's all got to be one aspect ratio. But it was really interesting to see how we ended up laying this out and the design that we went with and how it did end up, with the little details like you said of having, like the top margins the same or the height the same. There's these little things that you can do from a design standpoint that can help benefit the work a lot. So yeah, I mean, for the work I'm doing now, I'm like shooting one aspect ratio, but this was a nice lesson to me to just, I guess, like realize that there's things you can do beyond the image making when it comes to design and putting a body of work together where you can help tie things together.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a good takeaway for people too, is if a book is well designed and a lot of thought goes into the way it's assembled, you can make things that maybe are a little bit looser in their raw form tighter when it becomes a final book. But then again, when you're shooting, and this has been the takeaway you had from even making this book, is that like now going forward, you're like, I'm going to make a project in a specific format. So like you're not necessarily trying to fit together things that were made differently. Even making a book that turned out well from kind of like the different pieces that were assembled to make a book, your takeaway from that now going forward is I want to tighten things up a little bit in my approach as I'm making the work. And so those type of things are always kind of, lessons to be learned going forward. You do it one way and you say, well, that was nice, it turned out good, but like, here's how I can improve or streamline my approach going forward.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. But at the same time, too, I will say, um, as I've kind of got into the new work that I'm doing, it has also made me think about ways to get creative as well. Again, not doing things for just for the sake of it, but say shooting in 4:5 aspect ratio. But then, for Slate City, one of the things I've started to explore a little bit is have the main body of work that's shot on large format film, black and white, but then using a tool like an old original Brownie camera, or even like a pinhole camera shooting on 4:5, to have these like select images throughout that you're maybe even using like contact print size, to incorporate something different throughout this main body of work. And I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily something I'll stick with moving forward, but as much as working with multi-aspect ratio made me want to stick with one moving forward, there is part of me that is this takeaway of like, oh, you can also get creative with things, and if it's designed and laid out properly, it can work still as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's that kind of push and pull there. Sometimes you feel like you want to tighten things up, and then sometimes you decide, hey, actually, I want to go the opposite way. And like, I've made something that's really tightened up. Like, how can I add a little bit of more, surprise into it? And I think that's good. And I think it's an always, continually evolving conversation you have with yourself about the work you're making. You've made something one way, and then I think that goes back to the earlier part of our conversation. Like, maybe you've made something one way, you found it really successful, doesn't mean you always have to keep making it that same way. Like, the lesson or takeaway you have from each individual project you finish might like adjust your course one way or the other, and you don't have to like settle on one thing and say, this is it, I'm going to do it this way for the rest of my career. Like, those things are going to be constantly changing as you make work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like I said before, I think that was one of the really important lessons that I took away from that kind of change in focus. Not so much to be like, I'm going to do an American Mile and then I'm going to go shoot like, glamour fashion, like something completely different, but more so just like, I'm not going to shoot in the American Southwest now for the rest of my life and just put out books that are done in the exact same way. Like, be okay with not changing things completely, but adjusting approach a little bit. So maybe the next book I put out is similar in size and similar in design. I love the idea of doing Slate City with a, similar style when it comes to title display and stuff. But yeah, maybe there's a few additions from a design standpoint that play off of the subject matter, and that just switch things up a little bit. So it's like still respecting the importance of like vision and consistency and style, but adjusting and adapting and kind of evolving here and there when it makes sense.
Absolutely. And that's something, even as a publisher and designer, every single book I work on, I have some kind of established design languages, that I've used through a lot of the things I've done, published through Subjectively Objective. But at the same time, though, I actually have a new book that will be coming out later this year that is actually kind of pretty different from some of the other work I've done. But I feel like the book design that I ended up settling on was really in response to the work and what made it the best book for that work. Like, making it have the exact same type of, doing it like American Miles designed wouldn't have served that work the best. So like, whether it's, me as the designer or even you, making work, the idea that all of these things are kind of responses to what makes this thing the best version of itself. I think that, is a really wonderful and also freeing approach, that you don't feel like you have to say, I got to settle on this choice now because this is what I'm going to do forever. Like, you can be responsive. Each project will go in a little different direction. Each new book design, is going to be a little bit different in order to match what it needs to be for that particular project.
Yeah, no, I think that's important, and I'm certainly have learned that doing the opposite for a long period of time eventually gets you to a point where you just really dislike what you're doing. Trying to stick with one approach, doing things in the exact same way for, yeah, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, eventually gets old and, yeah, makes you question what you're doing.
Absolutely. Now, are there any lessons you feel like you've learned from the process of turning an American Mile into a book that are, any challenges that were faced that you feel like are, lessons to be taken away, that, things you don't want to repeat?
Yeah, so I think there were a few things for sure, which are to be expected, but a big one, I mean, a lot of the book was shot on film, and image prep was a big one. We decided to go and rescan all the images. I wanted to, just because I shot them over such a long period of time, and since I was getting back into film and that evolved as I was making the work, obviously my workflows and my approaches changed to, starting with a lab and then eventually scanning at home and refining that process. So the decision to rescan everything was the right one, but it was a lot of extra work that maybe I underestimated a little bit. Not to say that I would have wanted to do things differently, but for me moving forward, that's made me really refine my approach with the current work that I'm doing, just to know like when this is done and it's time to make something of it, like it's good. It's almost like not creating twice the amount of work for yourself. I think that was a big one. And then, not that this was anything I learned, but just or there was lots I learned about the actual book making and printing process. Obviously, you took care of a lot of the logistics and the technical side of that. But it was an experience for me because there was this anxiety involved when it came time to kind of make the final call. Because obviously you get a few rounds of like proofs. What were they called? I can't remember what they were called exactly when we would get the wet proofs, right?
Yeah, wet proof. So, just for a little background for anyone who doesn't understand what that is, a wet proof is actually a proof that's been printed on the same paper and on the same press as the book's actually going to be done. So, it is something that there is an additional cost of, because they actually do have to set up the press to, they're going to make a plate for it and they're going to run this sheet. I usually set them up. I'll show up here what they look like. But basically, I usually grid out all of the images that are in a project, put them all on one sheet. And so you get it's a big full-size press sheet, and you're able to kind of evaluate what all of the images actually look like on the paper that the book's going to be printed on. And that really gives you the best and final proof of what an offset printed book is going to look like. Now, if you happen to be on press, as they would say, while your book's being printed, you probably don't need a wet proof, because you're going to actually be able to see that as they start running, the first plate that they do of your book. It's not going to have all the images on it, but you'll kind of get that indication from that. Whereas I actually print my books in Lithuania, and so I can't be on press for them. And so a wet proof gives me, though, that final confirmation. Here's what everything is going to look like in print. And then I can feel confident, like everything's where I want it. And it also gives you an opportunity. That's like your last chance to make some tweaks. Like, even if things already look pretty good, from there you can say, that looks pretty good, but I wish this had a little more contrast. The color needs to move a little bit, anything, density needs to be adjusted a little bit. Those are your opportunities to make it. So even though there's an extra cost involved, I'm a big fan of making wet proofs, because they give you that opportunity to have like a real final test. And then you don't end up making all these copies of a book and being like, ooh, there was a mistake that was made there and I didn't get a chance to catch it. And now it's in the final book and it's going to live like that forever.
Yeah. I mean, that was so important. Obviously, again, my first time doing this and working with wet proofs, but obviously so important to be able to see, like, get an idea of what it's going to look like. And obviously we had a couple wet proofs done. We made a few like very minor adjustments, but still that was like making the final call, there was a lot of anxiety to it for me, just for no reason in particular other than you're basically saying it's good, start up the machines, and there's kind of no turning back at that point. And we did a fairly large number of copies for this first run for an American Mile, so it's like, it's a substantial amount of money involved, and you're locked in at that point. And we were very thorough with our approach. We'd seen wet proof, so there was no reason to be like, confident that we were going to get something we liked. But I guess maybe the fact that it was just my first book, there was like some anxiety to it, knowing that like, okay, these things are getting printed now. And I still remember when I got the first box of books and opening up the first one, and like a sigh of relief almost seeing it. Again, for no reason, because it's not like I thought it was going to show up and not be like what we expected, but I think it's just natural. It just kind of comes with the process. There was obviously an excitement as well, because it was such a process leading up to that, and so much work involved from the image making to all the time that we spent doing everything. So, yeah, anxiety and relief. But I think just it's like with anything moving forward. The next book, having an idea of the process involved and what to expect and the different steps we need to go through. I think it'll just make things. The next one will kind of just be much easier, feeling a little more experienced this time.
Absolutely. I think that's for me, again, as a publisher, I feel like I really do learn something from every single project I do. And, I try to take the lessons from those and incorporate them. And there's always new lessons to be learned, even when you're, experienced and have published a lot of books like I have. There's still always some new thing. And I agree, there's always there's that sense of anxiety that like, I'm really an advocate of triple checking every little bit before you send it off. Like, you definitely don't want to send things off and be like, oop, that was a stupid little mistake. And those are easy to make too. Like, it's a typo that wasn't proofed, or you actually in your InDesign file, you accidentally, while you were trying to navigate through it, you ended up grabbing an image and pulled it off to one corner so it's not aligned properly. Like, if you don't triple check things, like, those are the type of mistakes that get into your final book. And so, I'm big on trying to avoid those. And that's not to say that I'll never have a book where I triple checked and still miss something. Like, stuff happens, but I try to avoid that as much as possible. But again, there's also lessons learned, like you were talking about before. I definitely think making new scans was the right call for your project. But I would have been nice if we had done that before we launched the book. They would have taken the time it took, but we wouldn't have had to delay the actual book coming out, like, because nobody would have even known it was coming out at that point. So lessons like that of like, how can I learn, logistics lessons of like, these are the things they need to be done to make the project turn out the way it's supposed to. And that's great. But like, how can I do this more efficiently and make it so that, the people who are going to appreciate your thing, they don't have to wait as long to get their hands on the final product. All that kind of stuff, always lessons to be learned, and, things to get better at as you go and learn and do more.
Yeah, 100%. It doesn't work any other way, right? And that's not to say like, just be lazy in your approach and have all sorts of things go wrong. But I think just like, regardless of how well thought out things are and well approached, like, there's always going to be things that happen where you're like, okay, I would do that different next time. Like, I took something away from that. And that's what it's all about. I'm sure the next book that I do, there'll be things I take away from that, and so on and so on and so on.
Absolutely, for sure. I'll feel the same way. So now tell me just a little bit, now that you've made it American Mile, and we've already talked a little bit about how your approach has changed in all of these different small, subtle ways based on the experiences you've had. But like, what are you working on now? I know you're working on a couple different projects, and I guess, how do those relate to some of those experiences more specifically?
So I would say the main project that I'm working on now is called Slate City, which is focuses on this one specific area up in North Wales and kind of the slate history and landscape and towns, and just how the area was shaped by these basically massive slate quarries and slate mines. And that's all shot black and white, mostly 4:5 large format. And there's a few other projects that are, I would say, are like happening slowly in the background. I'm interested in doing a kind of a follow-up book to this, but a British Mile in a similar fashion, documenting the UK landscape in kind of a more a loose observational way, like I did with this project, whereas Slate City is something that is a different approach, where it has this kind of historical aspect to it and this fairly narrow focus on an area. But that's given me an opportunity to kind of take what I've learned from doing a project like this and go and evolve on that and take those lessons, but also try something new again, where I'm going into it with a little bit more of like a targeted approach and approaching it maybe creatively a little different as well, because obviously it's a very different landscape and I'm shooting black and white, very different weather, very different environment. So that's like, I would say that's the main project I have going on, but certainly it's been a much different experience wrapping up an American Mile and moving on. Whereas when this started, this was a 4 or 5 year period that it consumed me, but I came into this out of like a major low point, like we talked about. And this was really kind of like rediscovery along the way. So I would say I feel like I'm at kind of the most exciting point of my photography career that I've ever been at. Still like very challenging, and oftentimes where I am struggling with trying to figure it all out. But it's been really cool to go into making work with a lot more kind of intention behind it, and I guess like a more clear focus. So I'm excited to see where these next ones go.
Yeah, me too. I'm very excited to see how they go. I'm looking forward to seeing the British Mile, the follow up to an American Mile. Seeing how you really treat that kind of your similar approach to the vernacular landscape, but in a totally different place. Instead of the American Southwest, the British Isles. I don't know, there's not too many landscapes that are more of a contrast between that, unless you actually have something where you're like in the Alps or the Rockies or something like super mountainous. But as far as a even flatter landscape, the British Isles are so very different from the American West. But I think it's really interesting, the approach you're taking to Slate City, which is in some ways, you really focused it down on a more specific area, really looking more into kind of this historical framework for the project, but also even the format change, deciding to shoot it all black and white, really does give you a change of pace from the, very specific, color film aesthetic that you had going on for an American Mile.
Yeah, and it's funny, when I first moved over to the UK, I kind of took my habits with me that I had built up doing an American Mile, and was still shooting color film over here. I mean, a lot of a British Mile will end up being color film, but there was this period of friction for like a year when I moved over, because my way of working, I was like, it's not working, like I had these habits I built up, the specific film I would use and how I would process it. And it's almost like I had to go back into this bit of a period of experimentation to be like, okay, what works here in this landscape now? Because I can't just expect to transfer my, specific style over here, because the light's different. The color palette is incredibly different. It's dominated with green over here in the landscapes, and the weather's different and the light's different. So that's been a fun challenge. And I think that's also a big factor that led me to black and white, just because it opens up a new world of kind of creative possibilities and allows you to work in these, different weather conditions that might not be super ideal for color film all the time. So yeah, I'm just trying to honestly embrace it all. Like I said before, try and stick with like a vision and a style, but also just have fun, like evolving and adapting. So, now I look at it like a nice balance. Got a British Mile to kind of work on, shooting color film, similar approach to this, a little bit balanced with black and white, It's like I work on this one for a little bit and then I need a break and then I go to this one, and it gives me a nice balance of kind of approaches to play with.
I think it's interesting too, that it almost sounds like, kind of reflecting back to the very beginning of our conversation, not nearly as stark of a change, but even though you developed a process and a workflow for an American Mile, when you're in this new place, originally your instinct was, how can I just start applying this exact same process to it? And you were finding like there's some friction. This doesn't work in the same way it worked in the West, in the UK. And so starting on Slate City, giving yourself a little bit of change of, style and format, and even, conceptual framework and approach, kind of opened you up in a way to be able to go back to making work that is more like what you'd already done before, but allowed you to kind of acclimate and, not feel like you had to be forced into doing it the same way. So again, I think, maybe the biggest takeaway of our conversation is, don't be afraid to reinvent what you're doing as many times as you need to find something that fits.
Yeah, I think it's, for me at least, it is the key to a healthy and enjoyable creative career. I feel like I've really put in the time learning my lesson of what not to do. And that's not to say that like everything is great and I'm going smooth at all times now for me. Like I still have many periods of like questioning focus and direction, and if the work I'm making is good and if it's turning out how I want it to. But I think, like I said before, the big lesson I took away from before is like, don't be afraid to make changes and play and experiment and just try to try to avoid getting wrapped up in like ego as much as possible, or like self-image, where it's like, this is what people know me as, like, for this is what has been successful for me in the past, and I got to stick with this. Like I maybe it's just because I'm getting a bit older as well, but now I'm just like, how can I experiment and try things and have fun and learn and just see where it goes. And I think that's the key to like, enjoying photography for me, but also it's proven to me that is when I end up discovering and making my best work. It's not the points where I just try to stick with what I've done for the time, but when I have these periods of searching for what's next.
Yeah, and I think that's something that everyone is going to need to do from time to time. I know that I definitely relate to that, and with my own personal work, is that sometimes you have an approach, you're doing it and you feel good about it, and then you try it again and you're like, it doesn't work the same way it worked last time. And maybe that's the time you need to change gears and, try something else. And, maybe it is a new camera format or a different, subject matter that you're looking to approach, a different way you're approaching the concept. All of those things can be, nice ways to give yourself kind of a fresh start and allow you to jumpstart yourself. And because really the point is, you want to make work that you enjoy making, and that's the way you're going to make the work the best too, is if it's something you constantly feel excited about and not like it's a chore.
Yeah, man, absolutely. There's periods of play, I think, that kind of guide you or help you discover things. Like even Slate City, I went up to those landscapes for I think a year, just shooting and like enjoying it, but it took a year for me to be like, oh, this, like, here's a focus, and here's a name, and oh, this could be something. So yeah, I think just experimenting and playing and making little changes and trying new things.
Well, it was really great talking with you today, Kyle. Love to talk to you again in the future, and look forward to seeing what you come up with next.
Cool, man. Yeah, thanks for the chat.
Thanks, Kyle. I hope you guys enjoyed the interview. If you did, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and of course, if you'd like to support what I'm doing, buy one of Subjectively Objective's books or magazines, which includes Kyle's book, An American Mile. We still have copies, so go ahead and order one. I'll be seeing you again soon.